Welcome at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Alessandro Arduino, and I'm Principal Research Fellow at MEI. Today, I'm extremely glad to have with us Dr. Seth Jones, discussing his latest book, Three Dangerous Men. Dr. Seth Jones is a Senior Vice President at the Harold Brown Chair at CSIS, and he's also Director of the International Security Program and the Transnational Threat Project Center at CSIS. He teaches at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Study and the Center of Homeland Defense and Security, CHDS, at the United States Naval Postgraduate School. Prior to joining CSIS, Dr. Jones was the director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation. He also served as a representative for the Commander U.S. Special Operations Command to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. Before that, was a plant officer and advisor to the Commander General U.S. Special Operations Force in Afghanistan. Dr. Jones, in 2014, served on a congressional mandate panel that reviewed FBI implementation of counterterrorism recommendation contained in the 9/11 Commission report. Dr. Jones specialized in irregular warfare, counterterrorism, and covert action. And today, I'm extremely glad to welcome him at MEI webinar discussing three dangerous men in Russia, Iran, China, and the rise of irregular warfare. Welcome, Dr. Jones.
It's great to be on. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Prior to start our discussion, just a couple of house rules. We will have a 1-hour webinar. We are going to discuss for 20-30 minutes, and then we will open the floor to the question from our audience. Please just send the question using the Zoom chat box and using the MEI event link. So without further ado, we can start to discuss your book. And while I was really interested in reading all the very dense peculiarity about these three dangerous men, I realized that the first Gulf War, as you mentioned, has a profound impact on Russia, Chinese, and Iranian military officers, especially the three dangerous men that you mentioned in your book: Major General Valery Gerasimov, Zhang Youxia, and Qasem Soleimani, who recently was killed in a drone strike at Baghdad airport. And they all realized that no army on earth could match the might of the US Army in a direct confrontation. Since then, Russia, China, and Iran are focused on different tools. And these tools are the tools of irregular warfare and encompass cyber warfare, private military, economic coercion, operation of information, and disinformation. So in your book, taken from your book, how you describe each one of the three dangerous men in the way they are going to utilize this kind of tool? And also, do you think that the West is still stuck in a very myopic and narrow Clausewitzian definition of warfare? Seth, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. You lay out a number of good questions, from the Gulf War to the three dangerous men that I highlighted. Interestingly, in none of those countries do we see generally senior military women, which is why these are actually all men. Let me just first start with the Gulf War, and then I'll get into some of the specifics on the individual influential military figures in each of the countries. First is the Gulf War is important. It is yet another sign of U.S. Conventional military might. The U.S. both in the first and in the second Gulf War. In the first one, the U.S. uses significant joint warfare to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait. In the second one, obviously, the U.S. overthrows the Iraqi regime, and importantly, actually, then becomes stuck in an insurgency, which becomes very difficult for the U.S. military, including the U.S. Army, to handle. So there are two things that are of interest here. One is that the United States, with its Air Force, its Marine Corps, its Army, and its Navy has become quite proficient, not just in having military capabilities, but in actually using them to conduct operations, whether it's regime change or whether it's to defeat an adversarial conventional military in combat. The use of precision strike, the synchronization between air strikes and maneuver elements on the ground. Now, granted, the Iraqi army, both in the first and the second Gulf War, were not first world militaries. In either case, the U.S. was quite proficient. In addition, there were at least two or three other wars that were at the same time of interest as I looked at Russian, Chinese, and Iranian activity. And those were this combination of Kosovo, Afghanistan, at least in the 2001 context, and then about a decade later, Libya. And in all those cases, we actually saw was a very small maneuver element on the ground, a US maneuver element. And in addition, a heavy focus on special operations and or intelligence units on the ground, where the vast majority of the actual fighting was done by local forces. In addition, there was a lot of interest in the so-called color revolutions across what the Russians, for example, considered Africa, parts of the Middle East, certainly Eastern Europe, where there was some element of regime change, and this is, frankly, this has significant implications for today in Ukraine, where Maidan and what was essentially viewed in Moscow as a change of regime in Ukraine was viewed primarily as a U.S. Irregular warfare effort without using conventional forces to switch Ukraine from largely pro-Russian to a pro-Western government that was interested in joining NATO and the European Union. Now, I will say that that there was very little of that actually took place. In fact, as I look at many of these countries, they have much higher opinions and see the U.S. doing much more than it actually did. But those two kinds of wars were very instrumental, I think, as I looked at, and the whole focus of this was using translated sources from Russian, Chinese, and Persian, and a deep focus over time on specific individuals. So Soleimani, from the time he was particularly involved in the Iran-Iraq War, through his early years in the IRGC, then taking over as command of the Quds Force. Same thing with Gerasimov, from his time in tank school up through his multiple deployments in Poland and in the Baltics, obviously through his time to the Chief of the Army Staff. And the same with Zhang, as now the Vice Chairman of the CMC, but his involvement in the war in Vietnam and through his multiple tours. So let me just finish with kind of an overall comment about each of the three individuals I looked at: Zhang on the Chinese side, Valery Gerasimov, and then Qasem Soleimani and his successor Ismail Khani. I think with each of them, what they recognized in different ways was that the US remained very strong when it came to conventional and certainly nuclear war. Now, every country has to build conventional and nuclear capabilities. They have to do that for survival, and they have to do that to deter action against them. So by no means am I arguing that irregular warfare, the use of information campaigns, support to state and non-state partners, covert action, economic coercion is done instead of conventional or even building nuclear capabilities. Think of them as both important components of state power. So in this case, though, what we see is it's going to be very difficult to fight the US conventionally. I mean, as we started talking about in the first Gulf War, US has significant power projection capabilities. But I think as we see with the Iranians, their comparative advantage over time, Soleimani recognizes, is in building partner forces in Lebanon with Hezbollah, in Syria with the militias that the Iranians worked with over the last several years in reasserting Assad control over territory, in Iraq with the Hashd al-Shaabi, in the Houthis in Yemen with the significant attacks we've seen even recently against the Saudis. Same comments actually with the Russians and the Chinese. I won't go into detail, but I think what becomes important in each of these countries is how they used a focus on irregular warfare to do what I think is important in what we're now in an era of great power competition, which is to expand influence and power and weaken your adversary, but in this case, below the threshold of conventional warfare. I think in many ways, they have been successful to some degree, and happy to go into more details. But with that, let me just pause right now.
Thank you. No, definitely. When you mention efficiency in irregular warfare in your book, you stress the fact several times that authoritarian regime master resource in a faster way than liberal democracy. But looking into that, I recall that the so-called Pandora box of mercenary and private military company, and especially looking at private military company as a component of this irregular warfare, has been opened by the United States during the Iraq and Afghanistan war. So in some respect, I'm asking you if Blackwater was a good example for Moscow to follow up with the now ubiquitous Wagner group that is not a private military, is a quasi-private military, but also, if I recall correct, not long ago, Mr. Eric Prince, who was the founder of Blackwater, opened a shop in China with a joint venture with Citigroup in Hong Kong with FSG.
I think there's no question, if you look at what Valery Gerasimov wrote over the course of the 2000s and said, he was, and Russian officials were and have been very aware of the US use of private military companies in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and in a few other countries. I think over time, there probably are two differences in particular. You mentioned the Russians with the US use of private military companies and the way the Russians have conceived of them. One is, in general, the US did not use private military companies, the state, that is the US military or the State Department, for offensive operations. In general, private military companies were used, and this is Blackwater, DynCorp, and a number of others, for several purposes. Site security, particularly where there was no desire or little desire to have the US military do this. The focus was going to be on some train, advise, and assist with the US military or combat operations. Site security, except for bases probably, could be shelved to someone else, and this is where the contractors came in. With some elements of police training, for example, the US State Department is the lead agency for police training overseas. The problem is the State Department has no boots on the ground capabilities. So what state did in Afghanistan and Iraq is hire DynCorp to do the vast majority of police training. Now, over time, that was actually taken over by the military because the contractors did not do a particularly good job. In addition, there were other elements of assistance on strategic planning, for example, within key ministries that private military and security companies were involved in, like DynCorp and Blackwater and a number of others. But they were generally not involved, at least as a tool of the US government, in offensive operations. So that's one difference, particularly from what we see in places like Libya, where the Wagner Group has been involved in strikes from fixed-wing aircraft, artillery barrages. the involvement in armored personnel carriers and actually involved in combat operations. A second difference is the use of private military companies in the U.S. has become very controversial. Blackwater has been taken to court. The involvement of individuals in extrajudicial killings led to prosecution. In fact, Blackwater had to change its name. It became very difficult for U.S. government agencies to work a lot with private military companies. So the second difference, I think, is that particularly with the Russians, that they have used they've used Wagner Group and several other quasi companies actually as primary tools to provide site security, to provide combat operations, to provide intelligence collection and analysis in, as we've counted, over 36 countries. Lots in Africa, Central African Republic, Sudan, Libya, some in Latin America, including Venezuela, certainly the Middle East, and other areas, including South Asia, Eastern Europe. We've seen the Wagner Group and other companies involved, including, again, in combat operations. And I spoke with a number of senior U.S. officials involved in the strike against Wagner Group in Syria. They were involved in direct combat against U.S. forces. The U.S. killed roughly 300 Wagner Group contractors. But I think there we see the Russians trying to figure out whether the U.S. would actually conduct operations against Russians that weren't government, but were more quasi-government. And in this case, they did. They killed them. It was an extraordinary strike, even as I spoke to the head of U.S. Special Operations Command, and they had questions about whether this would trigger escalation with the Russians, which it generally did not. But I think this tool, we're starting to see the Chinese now use private military companies in a range of areas. This tool is helpful. It's deniable, or at least quasi-deniable. And we've seen Prigozhin also get involved in mineral extraction using private military companies. So there's an economic incentive to using it. But again, as we're seeing in a range of countries, the Central African Republic and Mozambique are probably the best examples. They can be costly. They can get involved in human rights abuses. They're not always effective. So I think countries are going to have to be very careful in to what degree they use them, because there clearly are downsides. And I think the U.S. experience, this is where you started off with that question, shows that there are definitely downsides to working with these kinds of organizations.
Thank you. The mentioning that what happened in Syria was quite important, because it traced the red line that the US was willing to cross. And if I recall correct, in a matter of minutes, they obliterated more than 200 Russian contractors with a barrage, artillery barrage, and helicopter strike attack. And at the same time, officially, the Russian military didn't blink an eye on that respect. So that was where the difference between quasi-military private military from Russia jump in. But if we look at China, I always like to discuss in Chinese term on private security. There is more company that have a passive use of violence in protecting Chinese personnel and Chinese infrastructure along the Belt and Road. But the direction this is going to take, it's probably more looking at a different option than the Western ones. Having said that, in your two answers, mentioned several times Russia and Libya. Was Libya, especially the Libyan experience, functional to the Russian way in looking at the future of war, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think Libya was central in two respects. One is it was an example, and this was the United States, the UK, and France in particular, with other NATO countries involved in operations. It was an example of how to effectively use local forces. In this case, there were militias from Misrata, from Darna, and other Libyan cities to engage in maneuver warfare on the ground and to retake or to take territory from the Libyan regime, and to get some limited assistance from outside. So what those Western countries did, as folks will recall, is they deployed on the ground special operations forces and intelligence units, not just for collection, but for paramilitary activity. And the primary direct involvement of military forces from France and the UK, the US, and others was in strikes. Strikes from fixed-wing aircraft, and then from maritime assets, particularly in the Mediterranean, where they could shoot cruise missiles. I mean, ideally, they could have also done more, but artillery barrages, cruise missile, the use of drones, of MQ-9s for some limited strike, but primarily also for ISR, for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as well as bomb damage assessment. So it really highlighted how one could use light military presence on the ground, enable local actors to do the vast majority of the maneuver to retake or take territory, and actually achieve significant results. In addition to using a heavy information campaign, Gerasimov repeatedly in the Libyan context was talking about the role that CNN played in undermining the Gaddafi regime, the legitimacy of it, took that as a lesson on how to use information, although in the Russian context, really also disinformation. And so if you look at the Russian campaign in Syria, where the Russians actually don't use much in the sense of a maneuver element on the ground, they rely on Syrian units, including the high-end Tiger units. They use Lebanese Hezbollah, including in and around cities like Aleppo, obviously with Soleimani and the IRGC Quds Force, as well as Palestinian militias, Iraqi Hashd al-Shabi militias, and others to retake territory in coordination with Syrian units. So the Russians don't deploy in any meaningful way conventional units. And actually, I see some strong parallels with the US prosecution of the Libyan campaign and the Russian campaign in Syria. The other big issue that happens in Syria is, or that happens with Libya for the Russians, is I think they also become increasingly convinced that the United States is interested in continuing to expand its power and influence, potentially at the expense of Moscow. It wasn't just the expansion of NATO and the European Union to Russia's borders. Think for a moment, from Moscow's perspective, expanding NATO to the Baltic states, you're bordering Russian territory right there. In addition, Libya was a Russian partner. Now that government has been overthrown, and in its place, the US, I mean, we know Libya has been a very difficult situation, and the Obama administration did the opposite of Afghanistan, where there was extensive nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was virtually nothing in Libya. So that's been a problematic case. But what we see regardless is that the US and others were involved in overthrowing a Russian partner, and then involved in replacing that with one or several actors in Libya. And as we see, if you fast forward around the same time, the Gerasimov, he over-attributed actions here, but he saw some US involvement in the Arab uprisings, in the color revolutions. And so Libya becomes a really important signal for the Russians that the US is interested in undermining regimes primarily through irregular means, especially with maneuver units on the ground. Very little US conventional presence, heavy focus on irregular activities, including irregular units, so special operations and intelligence, including other instruments of power, economic coercion, covert action, use of non-state parsers, information, disinformation. That Libya is a model of how to do it in some ways, but also the danger that the Russians were facing from a US which was using it. So I think it has this a dual purpose. And it strikes me as I have studied Gerasimov, how frequently over the course of 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, all the way up to today, he frequently mentions Libya as a turning point.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions more, but I see already the chat getting flooded by questions from the audience, and I will shift to that for the moment. And I have a very straightforward question from my colleague Azif, is that the three men just did their national duty. Why you call them dangerous?
The three men absolutely did their duty. The whole purpose of this book is to look at the other side of the hill. So looking at these three individuals in the mines and how they operated from a Russian, Chinese, and a Russian, Chinese, and Iranian perspective. The title, as folks that read it can see, I also spent significant time looking at how these figures were perceived by senior US officials. So I spent time talking on the record to several secretaries of defense, several CIA directors, senior State Department diplomats, and then many others involved, including several US Special Operations commanders. So the title comes from the perception, frankly, from US officials that all three of these individuals, and actually you can see this coming out in how they're perceived in the US as actually worthy adversaries, worthy competitors. Soleimani is a worthy competitor in the Middle East. He's very difficult for the US to compete against. Gerasimov as well, particularly as the Russians get into Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, Syria, even now in Ukraine again, and the Chinese into the South China Sea, including the Spratlys. So the dangerous, think of it like quotation marks, where a lot of this book is focused on how the Russians, Chinese, and Iranians perceive. The title is essentially how the US then perceives these individuals. So that's why that is in there, and it almost comes directly from a quote from an individual, a senior US official I interviewed on the record.
Oh, thank you. I agree with you. I mean, when we talk about Qasem Soleimani, Gerasimov, and Jen, we are talking about soldiers, someone that lead from the front, something that Qasem Soleimani did until the last minute of his life, something that Gerasimov used to say he was a commander of the 10th Division, and something that is really strange if we look at today People Liberation Army with Jen, that is one of the few general with real combat experience. Having said that, I have a question from Anthony Tio, who is founding board member here at MEI. It's very dense, so I try to compress it, and I hope I'm addressing it correctly. Non-traditional warfare is old as Hannibal's bloodbath defeat of the SPQR Legion, Senatus Populusque Romanorum, at Cannae, together with Hannibal mercenary Cadians and Tuareg cavalry that swamped the Roman and the Spanish mercenary cavalry. It was an encircle, it was a massacre. But despite that massacre, Roma survived another 500 years. But the United States is not old, nor is new Rome. Through having strong military warrior like General Patreus, that was with us just a few weeks ago in a webinar, and General McChrystal. But the United States short-term focus and wobbly divide in Senate, the people of America, plus the rise of military and stronger government in China and Russia is putting pressure on the United States. But the United States is going, basically, this I go on with the question, to survive as Rome did or not?
So just to be clear, that last part, the question is, will the US survive like Rome or not? Is that kind of the heart of the question?
I
Yes.
think I've just tried to compress
Yes.
it. It was versus the historic Roma and a weakened Hannibal short of Carthage support. Your comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I see, and I say this too, I see the competition that we see now across the globe, and I think it will increasingly be global. I do think the U.S. National Defense Strategy, which will likely be released next month in January of 2021, will probably focus too much, at least the early drafts, on the Indo-Pacific, as opposed to recognizing that competition really increasingly, especially with the Chinese, is global. But I think overall, it is a competition of systems. So on on the one hand, there are a number of political economic systems that support some elements of freedom of electing officials, freedom of speech, generally freedom of religion, freedom of access to information, and those that are in the authoritarian realm, which generally have closed societies, do not have general access to information. I mean, we can certainly see where Hong Kong has gone as the Chinese have enacted various laws in place, upped the Chinese security control in Hong Kong, no longer generally freedom of political participation, certainly not what they had before. So we have competing systems. I have to say, and I may be biased to some degree based on where I live and where I've studied, but I think in the long run, populations across the globe are going to strongly prefer over time living in generally open systems which support capitalism, open free trade, and open economic systems. As challenging as the last couple of years have been for the United States, I mean, I think there's also a great sense of resiliency where US citizens can criticize and vote individuals out of office, which happened in the 2020 elections. Trump was not reelected, and it was deeply criticized over his time. So I think over time, there's going to be, I would say, some resiliency in democratic states and systems against authoritarian ones. In fact, I have to say, I've been at a conference the last couple of days that a number of our Asian partners that the Koreans and Japanese have put on in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a very serious debate about whether the Chinese economy is actually plateauing or peaking as opposed to continuing to rise. I think if you look at Chinese concerns about stability, there are concerns about stability in the West, about the future of and stability in Hong Kong over the long run, concerns about meddling from outside. We know the Chinese are very concerned about any criticism. We've seen it recently with women tennis stars. So my argument over the long run is going to be, I think it's going to be very hard to control populations, to run and control state-run media, and to have populations over the long run be okay with that. So will the U.S. survive? I think so. And I think if you look at Samuel Huntington, this is where I'll end, and his democratization waves, that we're in a reversal right now globally. But I suspect, as we've seen with past waves, we will see that. We're in a reversal right now, but we'll see a wave at some point in the future. So I don't expect this to continue, into the future. There's no linear path forward. I think there are serious debates, frankly, about Chinese vulnerabilities over the long run that are going to even this thing out.
It's not correct. As you are mentioning, there is an ongoing discussion on economic development and the possibility for China to maintain the growth. But the answer to that was also drawn in the historical resolution that was published just a few weeks ago in Beijing, in which the two core points are moderate prosperity, and also it's mentioned the dual circulation. So a kind of way that China is trying to protect the inner part of the economy while still be connected globally. But this give me the chance to move from the boots on the ground that we have been talking about up to now to the cyberspace, not only in terms of face recognition, AI control of the population, and so on, but to look at how the competition in the cyberspace is changing the rule of the game. In the book, you mention one sentence: they can't close the gap by getting stronger. They can only close the gap by making the US weaker. So in your opinion, how is the future of the role of cyber operation? And especially, is it China going to surpass Russia in information dominance capabilities? Seth, you need to unmute yourself. I think is the most used sentence in 2020 and 2021.
I'm just catching up to you, that's all. I think when it comes to cyber operations, I actually think that Chinese have much better capabilities anyway than the Russians. When I look at MSS and PLA versus GRU, SVR, and even FSB, Chinese have serious cyber capabilities. Obviously, so does the United States with NSA, the British with GCHQ. What the Chinese, I would argue, have done differently is they have not been as overt and aggressive in conducting offensive cyber campaigns to take down systems. So if we look, for example, at the Russian, at two kinds of activities the Russians have been involved in. One is the offensive cyber attacks as part of military campaigns, where we see in the 2014, 15, 16, and then up to 2021, the Russians up until now have primarily focused on irregular hybrid activity in eastern Ukraine. And that is not using much in the sense of conventional forces, but supporting Russian-backed rebels to conduct the war. So below the threshold of conventional war. But to add to that element, offensive cyber capabilities and campaigns. So the use of in-destroyer, black energy, gray energy as part of GRU operations. Those have been important, targeting critical infrastructure, including blackouts in Kiev, and taking down the critical systems of electricity companies, of freight companies in Ukraine and others. So that's been an important, probably the most aggressive offensive cyber campaign to disrupt critical infrastructure activity of a foreign government. The second is we've also seen the Russians involved in offensive campaigns, but using non-state actors. So if we look at the Colonial Pipeline or the Greeley beef plant attacks, cyber attacks by the Russians, in both cases, they were Russian cyber hackers operating from Russian territory or in part from Russian territory, conducting serious operations. The Colonial Pipeline was a ransomware attack against Colonial Pipeline, which owns the major distribution hub for oil and gas from Houston, Texas, up through Linden, New Jersey, and the pipeline that goes there. So that was shut down during and after the ransomware attack. There were huge gas lines at U.S. Gas stations across the eastern seaboard, including in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a week period where it was virtually impossible to get gas in multiple states in the U.S. That was a pretty serious impact in which Americans actually felt pain. There was a run on gas for their cars that was the direct result of an offensive cyber campaign from Russian-linked hackers. We have not seen the Chinese actually do, at least yet, that kind of activity. They are fully capable of doing that. Frankly, as are many Western countries, including the US, is fully capable of conducting attacks like that. So I think the question is, under what conditions would we see the Chinese do that? Most of the cyber campaigns that we've seen the Chinese do are involved in disinformation, including around COVID-19 and the origins of it, and so involvement on social media platforms and others. We've seen heavy Chinese use of cyber for espionage, including stealing large amounts of security clearance information. That was the OPM, Office of Personal Management hack, or the Equifax hack, where the PLA went in and stole social security numbers and other sensitive information for half of American adults. A lot of that became public in a Department of Justice investigation and indictment of named PLA officers. So that's where, but every country is involved, frankly, including Western countries involved in that kind of action. I think the question is, if we started to see tension over, say, Taiwan, or more broadly within the South China Sea, would we start seeing China actually conduct the kinds of operations that we've seen the Russians do, that they are fully capable of doing right now, but have decided that it is, for the moment, not in their interest? So I'm not a cyber expert. We have individuals like Jim Lewis at CSIS that is a legitimate cyber expert, most of which I have to learn from people like Jim. But I would just say that's kind of my rough answer to Chinese cyber capabilities. They have much greater ones than GRU, than SVR and FSB have chosen for the moment not to use them.
And as you mentioned briefly about Ukraine, I have a question from my colleague Georgi. Irregulars in Donbass are portrayed as a freedom fighter by Russia now, but they were disavowed when they shot down a passenger plane. How much a manipulator state can be made responsible for its irregulars?
Well, there can be a couple of things that go along with holding states accountable. How much states care about this is an interesting question. So we have seen the Russians and Wagner Group held accountable for, or at least identified. They've been sanctioned. The U.S. has sanctioned Prigozhin and elements of Wagner Group. So there can be some economic steps that are taken. There can also be individuals taken to court, so they can be held accountable in some courts of law. And we've seen Russian private military company individuals sued and taken to court in foreign countries, including in and around Syria and in Africa, where they've been taken to court or at least charged. There may also be a kind of naming and shaming cost. I don't know how much at the end of the day some of these companies or countries are going to care that much about shaming. There also is a physical threat, which is, as we've seen with Wagner Group in Syria, where we actually had several hundred that were killed in combat, in that case by US strike and a heavy use of airstrikes with PGM, precision guided munitions, killing those forces on the ground. So there may be several ways to hold them accountable in that sense. At the end of the day, though, I would just say that when it comes to the use of some of these irregular forces, whether they're, Iraqi Hashd al-Shaabi Shia militias, whether they're Wagner Group or other Russian private military or security companies or quasi ones, or whether we're seeing the growth in Chinese ones, they're still viewed as, at the end of the day, in cost benefit analysis, generally beneficial. So there is a very serious question about whether measures taken against them, financial, including sanctions, threats, including strikes against several of them, legal measures taken against them, whether and how much that actually matters in the end, and how much these companies and countries care if they're serving a useful purpose, and in some cases actually making money, and in a few cases a lot of money. So there's I suspect it's a bit of a case by case analysis of costs and benefits, but I think overall, I mean, we see these countries continuing to use them, so I would say it hasn't deterred them so far.
So thank you. And following your answer, I have another question from Georgi, focused on Qasem Soleimani and on the Iranian part. A particularly reprehensible form of using irregulars as cannon fodder is the use of Shia Afghan in Syria by Iran Fatimiyu. And we can add that there are other cases like the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Any way to investigate the issue of coercion?
When you say coercion, meaning coercing the use of these individuals that are then deployed to countries like Syria or Nagorno-Karabakh, coercing individuals to go into these places. That's what the question is.
I do believe. I do.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I mean, that in the case of the Zainab Ayoun or the Fatima Ayoun or Hashid al-Shabi or other cases where we've seen the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Quds Force involved in part in recruiting individuals and then training them and then either coercing them, or in some cases we do see individuals volunteered in part probably after heavy indoctrination about the broader goals that they're serving. I think frankly, it's going to be hard to do much about the coercive or the much more kind of volunteer element of identifying, recruiting, training, and then using in operation these sorts of individuals. And part of the reason I say it is switching focus areas. There have been a lot of efforts to try to deter this kind of action from coercing individuals to become suicide bombers on multiple fronts. That's a difficult, when you're talking about individuals who may not have many other choices in life, and they are indoctrinated to serve what is sold to them as a greater goal in life, to fight for the broader Shia cause, much like we've seen groups like Al-Qaeda or Daesh recruit suicide bombers to go fight. Part of this sort of broader narrative that they are serving a greater good and that in the afterlife they will be rewarded. There's a similarity with how we've seen Shia foreign fighters recruited as well. That's a very difficult pipeline to stop. And I think really the only ways to start to effectively get into that are probably to start treating this as kind of combating that extremism within the areas they're recruiting. So out of the Shia populations in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or Iraq, highlighting in many cases, if one can do this convincingly, that they're serving, frankly, as puppets of a foreign government, or as we saw with Al-Qaeda or Daesh, serving as puppets of extremist organizations. How well that works, I think it's a tough sell. So I would just say there are some combating violent extremist steps that can be taken in these communities. There can be some broader information campaigns that can be conducted. How successful they are, I suspect, is going to vary quite a bit. But I see parallels, frankly, here with some of the extremist sort of jihadist recruitment efforts as well.
And as the time is running short to the end of our event, from my side, I'm abusing of my position of moderator to ask one of the latest questions, and I'm quite interested in posing this question, because if we look at George Kennan long telegram, at the time he was urging the American to study the Soviet Union, to study Russian, to study the language and culture, to be better prepared to understand what they were going to face. And it's some the way that you are looking from the other side of the wall in your book, and that's very promising in understanding not only Gerasimov, Soleimani, or Zhang, but the next one who is coming next. But I have a personal perception that as at the beginning, the scholar on Soviet Union and Russia were prized and cherished in the United States, at the end of the Cold War, they were looked at with suspicion, something of a fifth column. And again, as a sinologist, I have the impression that in the past, someone that is able to understand Chinese culture is valued, and now is just for the fact that study Chinese is in a way considered a kind of panda hacker. So in your opinion, is the United States, unlike the time in the Cold War, where there was a trust in investing in language and cultural and preparing the interpreter and the people who can understand the Soviet Union, are the US prepared to do this now, and the knowledge of China is able to percolate to Capitol Hill?
I think this is probably the area where the U.S. is weakest at this point. When I see Chinese activity to understand the U.S., understand its strengths and vulnerabilities, its reading of English material, I do not see the same kind of resources, effort that the U.S. has put into understanding China. I think the U.S. is extremely weak here. You started off with the Kennan highlight, and I would just note that in his long telegram, Kennan says, and he urges the U.S. to study, quote, to the Soviet Union, quote, with the same courage, detachment, objectivity, and determination with which a doctor studies an unruly and unreasonable individual. But to really understand in this case, a competitor. If you look at how few individuals speak Mandarin, how little the U.S. has put into broader translations of China. I mean, I think what's stunning is during the Cold War, the U.S. had a U.S. information agency. It had a foreign broadcast information service that translated huge amounts of Russian, Czechoslovak, Polish, East German radio programs, television broadcasts, newspaper accounts, speeches coming out of senior leaders, translated them into English, debated them. These were publicly available in any library, any major library in the US. That whole effort is gone. There is no US information agency anymore. It was decommissioned at the end of the Cold War. There is no rough comparison with the foreign broadcast information service. What's now the open source enterprise, which is within the U.S. Directorate for National Intelligence, or the DNI, it's not even open to the public anymore. There's no large-scale translation of Chinese material. How can you even begin to understand what is going on inside of China if you're reliant on the Chinese to translate their own material? I think it's stunning. One of the solutions at the Center for Strategic and International Studies we've done in combination with a range of foundations is we are starting an open source China analysis center in January of 2022. This has little to do with competition. It's more understanding. What are some of the key debates going on inside of China? It's involved in large-scale translation of the major Chinese political, economic, military documents, science and military strategy, among several others. The goal is just to understand, help understand. And I think that is where the US is weakest right now. It's far too insular. And if you look at the Chinese newspaper with the largest domestic circulation right now, it's a compilation of foreign news articles, including English language reports translated from foreign languages, including English, into Chinese. There's no equivalent of that in the US. So this I think right now is one of the primary US vulnerabilities. It is far too insular right now. Things are starting to change, but slowly.
And with this, I have just another question from the public to close, and we have 3 minutes, and I think we will need 3 days and not finding an answer. But you mentioned it before that we need to look from the other side, and when you were mentioning at the end of the Cold War, looking at the NATO expanding very fast toward Russia. And we see now this concentration of troops on the Ukrainian border, and the fact that if there is a status quo that is preserved at Ukraine, mostly as dysfunctional state, probably there will no Russian forces jumping in. But if there is a perception from Vladimir Putin that Ukrainian military forces are getting stronger, support from the West is more concrete, do you see, and you have the last 3 minutes, any problem arising from Russia and Ukraine in the next weeks?
Yeah, we've looked at satellite imagery of the Russian buildup, and a couple of just brief points. One is the forces that they have, 100,000 forces roughly at the moment, with some indications that they could go up to 175,000 or so. These are offensive forces. These are MLRS, these have artillery. It's easy to bring in air support, strategic bombers, fixed-wing aircraft. These are main battle tanks, but these are offensive forces. That should not be disputed. Second, though, is that, and importantly, if the Russians went into Ukraine, they would likely move fast. There's no deterrence here by denial. The U.S. does not have any, or other NATO countries do not have meaningful forward deployed forces. Compared to the Russians, the Ukrainian military is still relatively weak. Russian armor, particularly with airstrikes, I think would be able to move in hours, certainly days, into Kiev if that's where they wanted to go. So I don't think there's any, the Ukrainians are not going to stop a Russian conventional advance if they go. The third is to highlight this would be a big change in Russian activity. In Crimea, they went with Spetsnaz, KSO intelligence units. In Eastern Ukraine, after that, they went with largely same kinds of forces, KSO, Spetsnaz, the training of irregulars to operate in Eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, for example, against the Ukrainian government. In Syria, again, the maneuver elements were Lebanese Hezbollah, Shia militia from various countries that we've already talked about, Zainab Ayoun, Fatah Mayoun, and other foreign militia. This would be a big difference. It would also potentially make them quite vulnerable. And one of the things I suspect Putin is thinking very carefully about is the last major invasion they conducted like this was in the 1980s in Afghanistan. It did not go that well in the end, nor did it go that well for the US in Iraq or Afghanistan with 100,000 plus forces. So if the Russians move in, I am very well aware of what Valery Gerasimov has studied. He has studied his own country's campaigns in Afghanistan and the US's campaigns in Iraq and and in Afghanistan more recently, that I think is going to be, or should be, at the forefront of their minds if they go in with a conventional campaign, because that will raise the prospects not of the US or NATO countries entering directly, but entering through irregular means, anti-tank missiles, clandestine covert support, cyber operations, all the stuff we've been talking about these countries doing, now being done back to the Russians. I think that's their cost-benefit calculation right now, or if it's not, it should be.
And with this note, considering that I'm an incurable optimist and finger crossed nothing is going to happen in the following week, please allow me to thank you for your time, for being with us, and especially to thank all our audience that has been with us from the beginning to the end, especially the fact that it's quite late in the evening here in Singapore. Thank you again for being with us, and another thanks to the Middle East Institute event team for supporting us in the back. Have a great day. Bye.